Asimov's predictions about technology never came true at best and were plainly wrong at worst. His characterization of women was something people complained about for decades at this point. And his prose was never outstanding in the first place. And yet, the answer to the question in the title is yes. His works are definitely worth reading today in 2025. The real question is why? Why should we waste our time reading the scribbles of this ancient dinosaur when presumably there should be modern authors superior to him in every possible way? Let's start with prose. Prose is a matter of taste. In my view, his prose is simple, but it's not clunky enough to be obtrusive. Just don't go hunting for the beauty of language, and you'll enjoy his works just fine. Second, let's talk about women. Nowadays, it's almost hard to find a review where somebody doesn't apologize on Asimov's behalf for his awful depiction of women. And you might form an impression that Asimov is just bashing on women throughout all of his books. This is actually not the case. He has pretty strong female characters that are wiser, more observant, and sometimes more decisive and just smarter than their male counterparts. Both allies and very formidable enemies. He does have a bit dated or at least non-mainstream view on the topic of how emotions regulate female versus male behavior, how we differently deal with them, and how they affect our decisions. And I'm sure there are some other issues here and there to disagree with. If this disqualifies his works in your mind, that's your right. I would just encourage you to be consistent and purge everything published more than 10 years ago from your reading list, including classics, because our social mores and views are evolving at a breakneck pace, and if you want to really agree with everything with the author, make sure to lock in into the most modern and recent publications, otherwise you risk a chance of seeing something you don't agree with. With the first two issues out of the way, we're coming to the most critical and the most interesting one, the outdated technology. You might be tempted to dismiss the issue and say something like, hey, we're still reading Moby Dick, don't we? Even though almost nobody today is whaling, and those who do definitely don't do that on a sailboat. You can also say, if Asimov's technology is dated, what about Crime and Punishment? It's just a joke then. In our day and age, if you kill a rich person, your movement will be tracked and monitored all the way to a McDonald's in a different city. And that definitely doesn't happen in Dostoevsky. In this way, you would basically be saying, hey, science fiction is about stories, not about technology. But that argument would not be entirely honest, because science fiction as a genre is defined by its unusual technology. You could conceivably imagine Moby Dick rewritten with motorboats instead of sailing boats, and it might still work. It will be a slightly different story, but its essence might be preserved. If you remove all spaceships from a space opera, you're left with something really strange. And it's maybe some kind of historical fiction on sailing ships. Anyways, I'm not sure what would be left of that space opera, but it's definitely not going to be science fiction. What do we do then? Is outdated technology a death sentence for Asimov's writing? I don't think so, and here's why. Yes, science fiction is defined by unusual technology. But if you're just writing the most realistic, unusual technology that is likely to come up in the future, I'm sorry, you're not writing a science fiction book. You're making a patent application. A good science fiction technology is not just realistic, it highlights and explores what it means to be human or what it means to be sentient or good or evil by placing characters in situations that are impossible in real life and then exploring what happens. So, when a piece of technology that a science fiction writer invented becomes outdated, it kind of doesn't matter, because at the time of writing, the situations they explored were impossible because the technology wasn't there. Now the situations are impossible because the technology went along a different branch, but the situations remain interesting. And that, I believe, is what defines a good science fiction story and a good science fiction author. It's not about some gimmick that might or might not happen in the next 10, 50, 100 years. It is all about stories that can only be told thanks to that fictional, perhaps completely unrealistic technology. And Isaac Asimov is a master of that. If you like science fiction today, you have to read Isaac Asimov, if only for one simple reason. I believe that authors today actually avoid a certain type of story that he did so well that they're just not risking to try to replicate it. Especially when it comes to Foundation, I don't think I've ever seen anything on that scope and of that depth. In other words, there actually is no modern substitute for what Asimov did. Long story short, read Asimov, don't be confused by people saying that he's dated and whatever, and thank me later.